This is human anatomy, respiratory system notes, functions of the respiratory system. This is deliver oxygen and pick up CO2. Functions of the respiratory system: deliver oxygen, pick up CO2. Sound production, abdominal compression, respiratory functions, abdominal compression, respiratory functions, protective, reflexive, non-breathing air movement, such as sneezes and coughs, protective, reflexive, non-breathing air movement, such as sneezes and coughs, basic structure, nasal cavity and pharynx, or upper respiratory tract. Basic structure, nasal cavity and pharynx are a part of the upper respiratory tract. Nasal cavity and pharynx are a part of the upper respiratory tract. Larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli are part of the lower respiratory tract. Larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli are a part of the lower respiratory tract. Larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli are a part of the lower respiratory tract. Larynx, trachea, and bronchi lead up to the lung. Larynx, trachea, bronchi lead up to the lung. Bronchioles and alveoli are part of the lungs. Bronchioles and alveoli are part of the lungs. Conducting is moving air. Conducting is air movement. Conducting air movement. Respiratory divisions equals exchange in gases. Respiratory divisions equals exchange in gases. Respiratory divisions equals exchange in gases. Upper respiratory tract, sphenoid sinuses, frontal sinuses, nasal cavity, pharynx. Upper respiratory tract, sphenoidal sinuses, frontal sinuses, nasal cavity, pharynx. Upper respiratory tract, sphenoidal sinuses, frontal sinuses, nasal cavity, and pharynx. Lower respiratory tract, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, pleura, diaphragm. Lower respiratory tract, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs. Lower respiratory tract, larynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, pleura, diaphragm. Lower respiratory tract, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium creates mucus and lines the GI tract. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium creates mucus and lines the GI tract. Nose, nasal epithelium, olfactory epithelium, paranasal sinuses. Nose, nasal epithelium, olfactory epithelium, paranasal sinuses. Nose, nasal epithelium, olfactory epithelium, paranasal sinuses. Nasal epithelium secretes mucus. Nasal epithelium secretes mucus. Olfactory epithelium has to do with smell. Olfactory epithelium, smell. Dendrites trap odor. Olfactory epithelium, smell. Paranasal sinuses keep the sinuses moist. Paranasal sinuses keep the sinuses moist, help make mucus. Pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Pharynx, the pharynxes are the nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Nasopharynx connects nasal passages to the rest of respiratory. Nasopharynx connects nasal passages to rest of respiratory. Oropharynx, it allows air, food, and fluid to pass through. Oropharynx, it allows air, food, and fluid to pass through. Laryngopharynx regulates the passage of air to the lungs and food and fluid to the esophagus. Laryngopharynx regulates the passage of air to the lungs and food and fluid to the esophagus. larynx, cartilage, epiglottis, vocal folds, larynx, cartilage, epiglottis, vocal folds, larynx, cartilage, epiglottis, vocal folds. Cartilage surrounds and protects the vocal cords and trachea entrance. Cartilage surrounds and protects vocal cords and trachea entrance. Epiglottis prevents food and drink with lid from windpipe. Epiglottis prevents food and drink with lid from windpipe. Vocal folds vibrate and produce sound of your voice. Epiglottis prevents food and drink with lid from windpipe. Vocal folds vibrate and produce sound of your voice. Vocal folds produce sound of your voice. Trachea, a semi-rigid tube surrounded by incomplete rings of hyaline cartilage. Trachea, a semi-rigid tube surrounded by incomplete rings of hyaline cartilage. Trachea, a semi-rigid tube surrounded by incomplete rings of hyaline cartilage. Trachea connects the larynx to the bronchial tree. Trachea connects the larynx to the bronchial tree. Bronchial tree, primary bronchi, secondary lobar bronchi, tertiary segmental bronchi, respiratory bronchioles, alveoli, bronchial tree, primary bronchi, secondary lobar bronchi, tertiary segmental bronchi, respiratory bronchioles, alveoli, functional units, gas exchange, simple squamous epithelium must be kept moist. Alveoli, functional units, gas exchange, lined with simple squamous epithelium must be kept moist. Alveoli, functional units, gas exchange, is lined with simple squamous epithelium. Alveoli has to do with gas exchange, and alveoli must be kept moist. Notes on the lungs, right and left notes are divided into lobes. Right equals 3 lobes, left equals 2 lobes. Notes of the lungs, right and left, are divided into lobes. Right notes equals 3 lobes, left notes equals 2 lobes. Notes of the lungs, right and left, divided into lobes. So we got a right lobe and a left lobe of the notes on the lungs. The pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Nasopharynx connects the nasal passages to the rest of the respiratory system. Nasopharynx connects nasal passages to the rest of the respiratory system. Oropharynx has to do with the mouth. It allows air and food to pass through the mouth. Oropharynx has to do with the mouth. Allows air and fluid to pass through the mouth. Laryngopharynx has to do with the regulation of the lungs and esophagus. Laryngopharynx regulates the passage of air to lungs and food and fluid through the esophagus. Laryngopharynx, lungs and esophagus. Oropharynx, mouth. Nasopharynx connects nasal passages to respiratory. Down to larynx, the voice box or Adam's apple. Cartilage, epiglottis, vocal folds. Larynx, cartilage, epiglottis, vocal folds. Larynx, cartilage, epiglottis, vocal folds. Cartilage surrounds and protects vocal cord and trachea entrance. Cartilage surrounds and protects vocal cord and trachea entrance. Cartilage surrounds and protects vocal cord and trachea entrance. Epiglottis prevents food and drink with lid from windpipe. Epiglottis prevents food and drink with lid from windpipe. Epiglottis prevents food and drink with lid from windpipe. Vocal folds vibrate and produce sound of your voice. Vocal folds vibrate and produce sound of your voice. Vocal folds vibrate and produce sound of your voice. Larynx portal to trachea. Larynx portal to trachea. Larynx portal to trachea. All right. Trachea, a semi-rigid tube surrounded by incomplete rings of hyaline cartilage. The center of the trachea is lined with pseudostratified columnar, which creates mucus. Inside of the trachea is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar, which creates mucus. Trachea, and its job is to clean, warm, and humidify. Clean, warm, and humidify. Okay, back to the trachea. A semi-rigid tube surrounded by incomplete rings of hyaline cartilage. Trachea, a semi-rigid tube surrounded by incomplete rings of hyaline cartilage. Trachea connects the large larynx and bronchial tree. Trachea connects the large larynx and the bronchial tree. Bronchial tree, primary bronchi, secondary lobar bronchi, territory segmental bronchi, respiratory bronchioles, alveoli, air sacs, respiratory bronchioles, has muscle, no cartilage, territory segmental bronchi, is where it splits off three ways. Secondary lobar bronchi is where it splits off, and then primary bronchi is where it splits off from the main bronchial stem. Again, bronchial tree, primary bronchi, secondary lobar bronchi, territory segmental bronchi, has hyaline cartilage. Respiratory bronchioles, has muscle, no cartilage. Alveoli, air sacs. Primary bronchi, secondary lobar bronchi, territory bronchi, respiratory bronchioles, alveoli. Alveoli, functional units, gas exchange, made up of simple squamous epithelium, must be kept moist. Alveoli, functional units, gas exchange, is made up of simple squamous epithelium, must be kept moist. Alveoli, functional units, gas exchange, is made up of simple squamous epithelium, must be kept moist. Alveoli are the air sacs. They hold oxygen, and capillaries hold carbon monoxide, and when they exchange, it's called simple diffusion. So the oxygen goes into the capillary and the CO2 goes into the alveoli, the air sacs, the alveoli air sacs. So the carbon monoxide goes from the capillary to the alveoli air sacs, and the oxygen goes from the alveoli air sacs to the capillary, and that's called simple diffusion. Simple diffusion. Notes on the lungs, right and left, divided into lobes. Right equals 3 lobes, left equals 2 lobes. Notes on the lungs, right and left, divided into lobes. Right equals 3 lobes, left equals 2 lobes. Notes on the lungs, right and left, divided into lobes. Right equals 3 lobes, left equals 2 lobes. Covered by pleura, visceral pleura, parietal pleura, pleural cavity pleura. Covered by pleura, visceral pleura, parietal pleura, pleural cavity pleura, visceral pleura on organ, visceral pleura on organ, visceral pleura on organ, Parietal pleura is in the chest cavity. Parietal pleura is in the chest cavity. Parietal pleura is in the chest cavity. Pleural cavity is the potential space that lines pleura cavity. Pleural cavity is the potential space that lines pleura cavity. And those are the pleuras. Pleura is a protective covering. Next we got sinusoids, or sinuses, frontal sinus, ethmoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, maxillary, frontal sinus, ethmoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, maxillary, frontal sinus, ethmoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, maxillary, lungs, upper, middle, lower, lungs, upper, middle, lower part of the lung, upper, middle, lower part of the lung. That's pretty simple. Fissures separate the lobes. Oblique fissure is on the left lung. The right lung, the horizontal fissure. Fissures separate lobes. Oblique fissure is on the left lung. Right lung has a horizontal fissure. Fissures separate the lobes. Oblique fissure separates the lobe on the left lung, and the horizontal fissure separates the lobe on the right lung. Airway cartilage, this is what the inside of a lung looks like. The airway cartilage, airway, those are the airways, and then the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. Pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein in the airway. The airway is made up of cartilage, and the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein is below the airway. And those are made up of muscle. The airway is made up of cartilage, and pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein is made up of muscle. Those are below the airway. Let's see, apex is the top of the lung. We got the superior lobe, right lung, left lung. All right, that's it.